Good morning. I'm Lisa Stutz, Director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum History Center. I want to thank everyone for joining us for another virtual genealogy program that our volunteer and board member of the Friends of the Museum, Terri Meeks, will so graciously present for us this morning. This program is on remembering your Civil War ancestors, which will focus on researching service and pension records, amongst other things. But before we turn it over to Terri, I want to mention that if you have any questions during the presentation, to please post your questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring that, and Terri will address any of the questions posted at the end of her presentation. Having said that, again, thank you for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you are not having any difficulties either viewing or hearing, but in case you are, here's an email to get in touch with Dan, and hopefully he will be able to adjust any of these concerns. Today is actually Armed Forces Day. This is not a long-standing holiday. It started in the 1950s, and it celebrates those members of the military that are currently serving. And later this month, of course, we will celebrate Memorial Day, which originally was called Decoration Day and started in the 1890s. And it celebrates those who sacrificed their lives for their country. So we're just going to jump in today and talk specifically about Civil War ancestors who were involved in that particular conflict. Ever since the founding of the United States and even prior and during colonial times, wars have been part of our history. And today we're just going to look at the Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865. If you have an ancestor that was between the ages of 60 and 16, the question you need to ask yourself was, did they participate in the Civil War? And while these ages are loosely figured, we do know that some people younger than 16 participated, and some folks older than 60 also participated. The next question is, did your ancestor fight for the North or the South? I have a set of pictures that came down through my mother's family, and my mother always said one fought for the North, one fought for the South. Well, in doing the research, I found that one was with the regular Army and the other was a Union volunteer. So neither one of them fought for the South. And that brings up the question, were they in federal service? Were they part of the regular Army at that time? Or were they in a volunteer unit? And we'll look at both of those. We have to remember that when the war broke out, towns were small, towns were isolated, and the men usually enlisted in the town nearest to their home. Not only did they enlist, but relatives and neighbors also enlisted. So make sure you pay attention to the entire list of men that might be on a registration, because chances are another relative, whether a cousin, a brother, father, son, or other relationship, they are probably going to war together. If you're fortunate enough to find a service record, that person probably also applied for a pension. If he was killed during the war, or if he died after the war, perhaps his widow, his mother, or his dependent children might have applied for a pension as well. So don't overlook any of these records. The typical information that we find is name, rank, the unit that they were serving with, and the dates of service. On a more rare occasion, you might find an age and a hometown. Sometimes it will describe the action that the person was involved in, and very rarely they will give the color of the eyes and hair, height and weight, and identifying scars. Remember, this is the Civil War, and this is before dog tags. So if a person was killed during one of the conflicts, any identifying scars were used to identify the person. This is the first time that we are going to draft US citizens. And you'll notice this is the Enrollment Act of 1863. So the war has already been going on for 2 years, and they relied strictly on volunteers on both the Union and the Confederate sides. This is for the Union side. The Confederate side also did pass a conscription law in April of 1862. So both sides were looking to reinforce the numbers. They thought the war was going to end probably within 30 to 60 days, but at this point, it has been dragging on for almost 2 years. This particular conscription act asked males between the ages of 20 and 45 to enroll. And that's one of the important distinctions. They did not necessarily serve, but we do get the Enrollment Act. Even aliens who had started their citizenship applications were required to enroll. Here again, not necessarily to serve, but merely to enroll. Exemptions could be bought. So if you had enough money, $300, a significant amount, you could pay to get out of your military service. You could also find a substitute who would go in your place. And as we just mentioned, the Confederates also did have a compulsory military draft. I'm going to give you a few statistics at the moment. There were 11 Confederate states, and there were approximately 750,000 to 1.2 million individuals who enlisted in the Confederate Army. Roughly 400,000 of those men were drafted. There were 3 registrations in April of 1862 for males ages 18 to 35, September for those aged 18 to 45, and by February of 1864, they were desperate, so anyone between 17 and 50. There were 20 states in the Union armies, and approximately 2.2 million individuals enlisted in the Union Army. Only 776,000 of them are listed in the draft records, still a significant number, and 47,000 were conscripted. There were 4 draft registrations in the Union Army for those men ages 20 to 45. Not only could you pay the $300 to get out of it, if you were so inclined, you could receive a $100 bounty if you decided to enlist. And there were posters for both bounty rewards as well as finding substitutes. So these men that were required to register, there are currently the consolidated enrollment lists. And these are registers of the men that we just talked about, those eligible for the draft. They are arranged by state, congressional district, and then alphabetically. They are available on Ancestry.com and are relatively easy to find. They have been very well indexed. They are divided into three parts. There were Class 1 men, all men between the ages of 20 and 35, whether single or married, and also unmarried men from 30 to 44. There was a Class 2 for the married men between 36 and 44. And finally, Class 3 was made up of volunteers. And we're going to take a look at some of these. Here is a Class 1 registration, and it does indicate up in the top that it is Class 1, 2, and I haven't been able to actually find any for the Class 3. But we get the different counties that are represented in the congressional district. The date, for the most part, is June of 1863, and we get a list of names for the towns where they came from, the names of the actual individuals, how old they are, their race, what their occupations were, whether they're single or married. Apologize. Oh, and if they had any previous military service. And we happen to notice in this one, here again, it's 1863. So all of these men have previously volunteered for service and have previously served up until this point. And we also noticed that there might be some remarks in them. Here is another Class 1 registration. This one is from the state of Michigan and contains all of the same information. We noticed, however, that this is the first time that these people are actually registering and enrolling. And we also see a couple of remarks. Blind in one eye. There's one down at the bottom that the gentleman says that he is 35 years old, but other people dispute this. If he was 35 years old, if he was 36, excuse me, he says he's 36 years old. And if he's 36 years old, then he belongs on Class 2, so he wouldn't have to be enrolled. So there's some dispute about that, but his friends say, no, he's underage. He's 35 and eligible to enroll. So look at these carefully, because sometimes there are some interesting comments in the remarks. Also, people claimed that they were aliens, so that they might not have to actually fight. They did have to enroll, but if they were an alien, their allegiance was still to their former home country. Class 2, again, it is indicated on the form, and these are going to be your older gentlemen, whether married or single. And we find similar information about their nativity as well as their occupations. We note that this gentleman has been drafted, but he's hired a substitute. And we have someone else that is claiming a disability. So if you find your ancestor in one of these, be sure to look at all of the information about it. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't able to find a Class 3 registration, but this one is from Anne Arundel County in Maryland. Maryland was a border state, so people could have served on either the Union or the Confederate side. And I believe there were 5 border states at the time. So we noticed that many of these people, or all of these people, have been drafted. One gentleman is actually deceased, and it tells what date they were actually drafted on. So again, Ancestry has these lists available for you. When looking at those who actually served, we are going to find two main categories of records: the compiled service records and the pension applications and payment records. The compiled service records are those that were made exclusively for the military. They're going to contain essentially your name, rank, and serial number. The pension applications are going to be the ones that give you the most genealogical information. Both are valuable in their own unique ways. The compiled service records are also formally known as the compiled military service records. And this project was begun in the 1890s to record this information. It turns out by this time, many of the veterans are looking for pensions, are looking for benefits as a result of their military service. And to make the validation of these claims easier, they started compiling their military service records. They started first with the Civil War and went backwards and covered the Revolutionary War all the way up through the Spanish-American War. So the War of 1812, Civil War, etc., were covered. Those after the Spanish-American War are not covered in military service records. These also just document the volunteer soldiers. They do not include those that served in the regular Army. They are transcribed from the original muster rolls, and mustering means when did the person enter service and when was the person discharged from service. They also look at payrolls, regimental returns. Each regiment was required on a monthly basis to provide statistics as to their ability to meet the needs of the Army. So there was a count of how many people were available for service, how many were injured, etc. Hospital rolls were also looked at, as well as other documents. And we've talked about why this came about. If you've seen these on Ancestry or on Family Search or through Fold 3, you'll recognize that the initial page is an envelope or a jacket with a series of numbers recorded on them. For each one of those numbers, there is a card that has been prepared. And each time the person's name appeared in any one of those documents, one of these numbered cards was prepared. For the most part, as I said, these are for the military use, so it gives the rank, the unit that the person was serving in, the date that they were mustered in, the date that they were mustered out, and it may contain some biographical or other information, mostly military information. Promotions, if they went from a private to a corporal, there would be a separate card to indicate the promotion. One of the best pieces of information on this is the unit that your person served in, because that's going to open a lot of information for you to find out about your military ancestor. Here's an example of one of those cards. We find that John LeMaster is in the Company C of the 3rd West Virginia Cavalry. He's a private and his job is a saddler. And we see that there is a listing of numbered cards. I have been very disappointed. I actually recently went to a family history center to use Fold 3 knowing that they were a military records website. And I had thought that they would provide the actual individual cards and the descriptions on those cards. However, I was unsuccessful in the names that I was looking for to find these information. These cards are available through the National Archives. You can send and get the complete record of your ancestor with that information. Here's another one, but this is from the Confederate side, and we are in Company K, the 37th North Carolina Infantry, and we see quite a number of cards. And for the most part, these will talk about the draft was probably for either a 30 or a 60-day period. So many of these cards might indicate that the person was mustered in. 3 months later, they're mustered in again. 3 months later, etc. They are continued to be mustered in. It might include any wounds, any hospitalizations, any promotions, as we discussed earlier. A little bit different muster roll is this one for Daniel Gunnan, and it shows that he came into the service on January 14th of 1864 at Troy, New York, and he's in Company L of the 7th Heavy Artillery. And then again in March, he is again assigned to Company L of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery. In April of 1865, he is transferred to Company A from L. And the unit, this is late in the war, they are consolidating. They're merging and getting smaller. His name is listed as Gunning at the top, but it says Gunnan down at the bottom. So this means you're going to have to look in perhaps 2 or 3 different places to find his records with the spellings. Indicates that he was wounded at Cold Harbor, and his nativity, what his occupation was, and it gives a physical description of him as well. There is a second page, here again, transferring from Company L to A, and that he was mustered out in Baltimore in 1865. So a different form, and what's some of the information that is behind those cover cards. Here is one for a captain, and this is for, he's in Company H of the 5th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Cavalry, 28 years old, and this is the information that is behind one of those cards. This is part of the regular Army, so it's a little bit different. Rather than the volunteers, it is a card that gives specific information on when he received his appointment to an officer. He had been simply a sergeant prior, and I guess he was a sergeant, enlisted, and went over to being an officer. The pension applications. The National Archives contains all of these records, the pension applications, as well as the military service records. It also has the payments that were made for the veterans, their widows, or any other heirs. And the pension applications are based on service anywhere from 1775 up to 1912. Today, we are looking specifically at the Civil War records, but they do exist for the others. And I do have to, while I criticized Fold 3, I do have to go back and say, if you have a Revolutionary War relative, they do have all of the information posted for the service records as well as the pension applications. They are currently working on the 1812 records. They do have the indexes, and they are working to get the actual records behind those online. The pension application files usually provide the most genealogical information, especially if it's widows and heirs that are trying to get some form of payment for their relatives' service. Many of the documents will contain narratives of the events during service, especially if they're applying for compensation as the result of an injury. Where did they acquire that injury, under what circumstances, and what is the level of the injury that they sustained? For those that are widows or heirs, children that are dependent, they are going to have to provide marriage certificates. They're going to have birth and death records. Birth certificates and death certificates, for the most part, prior to 1912, do not exist. But family Bibles can be used, or other kinds of family letters that might document these events in a person's life. For those that do not have actual certificates, then depositions from witnesses or affidavits from witnesses have to be provided. And if there are discharge papers, you're going to find these as well. So how did the pensions come about, and when did your ancestor qualify for one of these pensions? There was a general law as early as 1862 that awarded pensions to soldiers that were injured during the Civil War, as well as acknowledging the surviving widows and minor children of those that were killed during the war. There is also a Disability Act of 1890, which allowed for pensions based solely on a period of time of service. So if your ancestor completed his enlistment, whether it be 30 or 60 days or a considerably longer period of time, he would have been eligible under this act to receive a pension. It increased the eligibility of widows and dependents, and it also increased the monthly stipend for them. There are three types of pensions. The disability, which is self-explanatory. Did they incur some form of injury in the line of duty that would allow them to qualify for a pension? The service pension, also for a specified period of time, they had served honorably and would qualify. And obviously the widow's pension as well. The husband was killed in the war or survived, but has died subsequently and served for the specific period, and now she is eligible for that pension. Here is a pension application for a Martin Cooney. Once again, we get that he was in Company E of the 7th U.S. Infantry. And in 1865, he is applying for a pension based on an injury occurred during the war. We notice that there is no certificate number recorded. This means that he did not qualify for a pension. It does not mean that there isn't all of the information behind this card. If the explanation for what his injury was, etc., will be still recorded, even though he did not qualify. And as it turns out, he was actually injured in 1860 prior to the Civil War, and that is probably why he is not eligible for this particular pension. Our gentleman that we looked at earlier, Daniel Gunnan, spelled this time with an E, different spellings, having served in both companies A and L of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery, he is applying in 1866 for a pension based on wounds that he had received. And from the muster roll, we saw that he had been wounded at Cold Harbor. He is given a certificate number, which means that he did receive a pension. In 1893, his widow is applying for his pension. This also, if you do not have a death certificate, which in 1893 would be very unlikely, it gives you a clue as to when he might have died. So pay attention to the actual dates that some of these applications are being made. The application number and the actual certificate number honoring his, or acknowledging that she indeed is eligible for his pension. We also note that the state from which the pension application is filed, and that's New York State at this particular time. He happened to have served in the New York Heavy Artillery, but this does not necessarily mean that the application would be made. If the family had moved, he might have served in one unit from one particular state, but the family might currently be living in a completely different state, in which case he would still be eligible for his pension. I realize that you cannot read this information, but just so that you see what kind of information is contained behind the records. This is a direct declaration for original invalid pension. And the date that the person is actually applying in September of 1888, it is Cornelius Sullivan, and it gives the dates that he entered and left the service, what unit he served in. And it gives a complete description of exactly what battle, what time, and what his injury was that he had sustained. So that there is a lot of information contained on this. If you have a pension application, there may be numerous forms. I would say that there's probably going to be at least 2 to 3 pages of information. It will talk about when the person was married, to whom they were married, when the person might have actually died, and it might contain a death certificate. It's probably going to contain affidavits from those people, from friends and or relatives, to confirm the marriage date, to confirm the death date. So multiple pages will occur on the actual widow's pension. We'll list any minor children. And here again, we're talking perhaps early on in the 1880s, 1890s. So you get the idea of when children may have been born, if they are minor children, where predating birth certificates. This is an actual pension payment card. We saw that Daniel applied for a pension based on injury. This is from when his wife applied for her widow's pension, and in June of 1893, and the pension was awarded in April of 94. And it continued until her death, and her minor children had attained their majority. And here is the actual payment voucher. And you'll notice that this certificate number matches the certificate number under the widow's pension card that we saw initially. We see that she is paid on a quarterly basis for the first, second, and third of quarters, and the actual day of the month that those quarters. And she received $36, which in the early 1900s is not a significant amount. Let's take a look at some of the Confederate records as well. As we stated very early on, it's important to know which side of the conflict that your ancestor served on. And for the Union side, it was referred to as the Civil War. For the Confederate side, for the most part, it was known as the War between the states. And there are actually 100 different names for the Civil War, one of them being just simply the war. If your ancestor fought for the Confederates, his military records probably are going to be at the National Archives, but they're going to be in a completely separate series from the Union records. The pension records, and I will note that these are the compiled service records, and not all of them have survived. So the records are scanty by comparison with those on the Union side. Pension records will not be at the National Archives because the US government didn't see fit to provide pensions until 1959 for the Confederate veterans. And by that time, only a few people were left living. So considering that the war had ended almost 100 years prior, it very unlikely. But there are Confederate pension records, and the states started to provide those pensions. If you are interested in trying to find a Confederate pension, you'll need to look at the state in which they actually were living. These are 3 books that will help you find the state archives. But if you do a simple Google search for, Ohio State Archives, Alabama State Archives, whichever, you will find that information online and what their availability is under the current situation. Many large libraries also have access to the indexes for Confederate pension lists. And information for each state can be found on this National Archives website. They'll give you a complete description, and they will have a complete listing of where all of the archives are for all 50 states. Don't overlook, either on the Union or the Confederate side, a pension application index. Your ancestor might not have qualified, and he might not have even applied for a pension, but take the time to actually look just in case, because his mother, his widow, and minor children, they may have applied after his death. And as we've mentioned, even if he was denied the pension, the application is still on file and can provide a lot of informative information. There is a large Confederate Research Center at Hill College in Hillsborough, Texas. It was started with a simple gift of a number of books, but it now houses many, many books, and it has one of the largest collections west of the Mississippi for Confederate records. And I have the address listed on here. If you want to do a screenshot to get the name and address, please, by all means, go ahead. This presentation is also being filmed and will be available on the museum's website, YouTube website, may correct that, so that you can go through and review as well to get any of the information that might have been passed over. Not everyone did apply for a pension, and not all volunteers or veterans actually qualified for them. And the information that is contained in those documents is only as valid as the person was honest or informed. In many cases, if a minor child is applying, or a guardian on behalf of the child, they may not know all of the information pertaining to the veteran. So some of the information, you need to know who the informant is, who the actual person is that is providing the information for the validity. The wives, mothers, and children may have applied after his death. And here again, the federal government did not provide benefits until 1959. So if we can't find something in the compiled service records or in the pension records, what are some other sources that might give us clues as to whether our person actually served in the military during that time? We can look at the 1890 special census of Union veterans. And unfortunately, only the states K through W, along with the District of Columbia, records exist. And we'll take a look at one of those. There is also, run by the National Park Service, there is the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors System. And we'll take a look at that as well. If you know your Civil War veterans company and regiment number, there are numerous sources, both online and in terms of books, that can give you complete descriptions of where your ancestor might have fought, the circumstances under which they fought, the wars, the battles that they participated in, etc. Here's an example from the 1890 census. And the first thing we notice on the first line, we have Elizabeth, widow of, and then her husband's name. He was a private. What company he was in, what unit he was in, the date that he was mustered in, the date that he was mustered out, and his length of service. It will give the individual veterans' names, or we see the widows' names, but it gives the complete information about what particular unit. This can be valuable if you have an ancestor with a common name, for example. This might help you if you know that your ancestor lived in a particular locality in 1890. This may be able to help you distinguish your John Smith from the myriad of other John Smiths. It gives the post office address that is closest to them, and in the remarks, it may give you any injuries or any other information that might be available. This is a strain of the right hip. The National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors Database. This is just the top part of the page, but it gives you the opportunity to search for soldiers, those that served in the Army, whether they be Union or Confederate. They give you the sailors the same way, whether they Union or Confederate. And it gives you regimental histories that could be valuable once you learn that regiment. As I said, sometimes a simple Google search on what unit your ancestor served in. This is for that Daniel Gunnan. He was in the 7th New York Heavy Artillery, and it talks about the formation of the unit, when it was actually formed and constituted, who the various commanders were at the time, the formation of each of the companies, and where the folks came from that actually participated in it. And some of the activities of the regiment. This is only one of several possible pages that you might find. And as I mentioned earlier, books. Don't forget to overlook books. I happened to stumble upon this book. It's called Carnival of Blood, The Civil War Ordeal of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery. It turns out that the gentleman that wrote this book, his ancestor was a man named O'Day, and he could never find any records for his great-grandfather. And so he started working on the book to try and figure out. He knew what unit the man had served in from family correspondence, but he could never find any records. And it turned out that his great-grandfather's records were listed under his first name, middle initial O, last name Day, rather than the surname O''Day. But we are the benefits today of his research. And my relative, Mr. Gunnan, is actually mentioned in the book. So look for books. Hundreds of them have been written. Even if your ancestor is not mentioned in them, if you know the unit that he participated in, you can find out exactly which battles they participated in and which company was there at the battle, etc. Tombstones. Simply looking at tombstones will also help you with information. This is a tombstone, and it is one of my relatives who was a regular Army soldier. He was in just the regular US Army. And you'll see the number on the tombstone. This happens to come from the Marietta National Cemetery in Georgia, where this man really never lived. He just died there. But the number is a sequential number, and the tombstones are all arranged in that sequential order. So it's very easy to find the tombstone of your ancestor if he's in one of these national cemeteries. For the most part, we see tombstones that do give us the company, the regiment, and whether they were from the Grand Army of the Republic or the Confederate States of America, and their birth and death dates. But it gives you that key information to look further for information. Here is a gentleman who is a private in Company A of the 55th U.S. Colored Troops during the Civil War. So look for those unit histories as well. Something that we never think we'd overlook at this point is that there were national homes. These were for disabled veterans, and there were 12 of them throughout the states from the period of 1866 up until most of them closed by 1938. Admission and discharge in these places was completely voluntary. And here again, the records are available on Ancestry. And we see that each person gets a complete page, and it does get the military history, what date the person is entering the home, what unit they served in, when they're entering, why they're entering. We have some domestic information about where they were born, how old they are, height, weight, coloring, etc. And who is the closest person to them that might be notified of anything. And we see an admission date, a discharge date. And we see this gentleman has come in and gone out on several different occasions. He also received a pension, so there is a pension number down below. And we see similar information for another gentleman who simply entered and perhaps died at the place. So another piece of information. And you ask, what about the Navy? There were people, not only did people serve in the Army, there were Navy records as well. However, here again, at the National Archives, you can look for records there. For the most part, we get the lists of the ships, the data mostly about the ships themselves, and you can get photos of the ships. And there are some muster rolls. There are no compiled service records for the Navy or the Marine Corps. So remember that. There may be pension records, but there are not going to be compiled service records. There are, however, some books that you might find about Navy and Navy service. This is from a website called archive.org. Let me go back. Yes, this is a book, not the National Archives. I stand corrected. I am sorry about that. This is a book from archive.org, and they deal with out of print and out of copyright books and publish those online. They are searchable. So I searched just for the simple name of Jones, knowing that I was going to come up with 100 hits. And sure enough, these are all the hits for Jones to go through. But it is a muster roll, and it lists who the crew was on a particular ship for a particular point in time. It is a laborious task, as it is quite a large volume. It is multiple, if I'm not mistaken, it was over 1,000 pages, but it does have pictures of the ship, and it does have muster rolls. And it is kind of searchable. So if you have a Navy veteran, it's going to take time, but it might be very worthwhile. I mentioned earlier that we've seen the indexes and we've seen the cards and the numbers and the pension numbers that have been listed on each one of these indexes. If you want the information that is contained on each one of these, if you want the military service records, you need to go to the National Archives and fill out a Form 86. If you want the pension records, it's Form 85. And as recently as yesterday, I checked online, and you can make the request. They will be filled in the order in which they received, but they have been suspended for the last 10 months to 1 year. So it's going to be a considerable wait in order to obtain these. I would encourage you to go ahead and apply for these papers. I have a relative that was in the cavalry for 43 years, and I did request his information. I got approximately 2 inches thick worth of paperwork that gave all of his military service, each one of his promotions, all of his illnesses. There were 2 key pieces of information within that 2-inch thick file of paperwork. One was a letter written by him requesting service medals, and it outlined when he entered the cavalry, all of the battles that he had participated in order to qualify for those medals. The second, and also it gave his birth date and exactly where in Ireland he was born. The second one was actually a letter written during the Civil War from his mother in Ireland to his commanding officer, saying she hadn't heard from her boy and was he okay? And it gave her return address. So I was able to find out exactly where she was living in 1864. So there can be some gold nuggets in this information. So we'll open it up to questions at this particular point in time.
Well, Terry, we have had 10 attendees today, and we had one gentleman all the way from the East Coast.
Yay, welcome.
And being from Oklahoma myself, I cannot pronounce that real long state name, which is called
Massachusetts.
Oh yeah, it's easy for you to say. So anyway, Gary had a couple of questions, and the first question had to do with different veterans organizations like the Sons of the Union Veterans or Sons of the Confederate Veterans or the United Daughters of the Confederacy. He asked the question, is there any chance of getting information from the veterans organizations from the members' applications?
Yes. Yes. Just like the Daughters of the Revolution, the DAR, the Daughters of the Revolution. If you write to those various organizations, yes, they will happily provide any paperwork that the person has submitted in order to get membership in that particular organization. So yes, just simply by writing to the organization. And I would say also check out if they have websites as well, because you may be able to, I know on the DAR website, which of course is the Revolutionary War, not the Civil War, I know that they do have, you can request copies of the papers from the website. So yes, I would encourage you, they do have the paperwork and they do keep it and they will supply it.
Okay. His second question had to do with on the information about the draft information. Do you have any suggestion on identifying what counties were in the congressional districts in the states? Counties in the congressional districts.
I have not actually explored that, but I do believe I may be misspeaking, but there is a gentleman named Steve Morse, and it's stevemorse.org. not stevemorse.com. That's a rock and roll singer. stevemorse.org. He has an extensive website with help aids, primarily dealing with Ellis Island and the census, but he may also have something along those lines. Counties and of course over time those districts have probably changed. I will investigate that, and I will have the museum post information for you.
Okay. Dave did say that both the DAR and the SAR have a fee to obtain those records.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
One final note. I looked up trying to find who was the last person to receive a Civil War pension. And I was extremely surprised because I thought they were all gone, because we're now 150 years away from the Civil War. As of the 31st of May of 2020, Irene Triplett was the last person to receive a Civil War pension, and she received $73.13 per month. She was the daughter of Mose Triplett, who had married Alida Hall in 1924, and he was 84 years old when Irene was born. And he died in 1938. His wife Alida died in 1967, and Irene, who was a quote unquote helpless adult child, died in May of 2020. So we're not paying any Civil War pensions any longer.
Okay, Terry, we had no more questions asked, but we did get a thank you shout out from Gary. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And if we have not had time to answer your question, if you want to email me directly.
Okay, one more question.
Yay.
Dave asks, would she know about the shape of the Confederate or the Union gravestones? I believe the Confederate had a pointy top while the Union had a curved top. About the shape of the top is.
Yeah, I understand. And I did in the presentation, I did perceive that that was true. However, I'm not sure whether that is a uniform designation. Something else to check out.
All right, that's it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I'll plug on next month's presentation. With the relaxing of some of our restrictions, perhaps you're planning a short trip, and perhaps you might be thinking about doing some genealogy along that way. So if you're in the mood for an adventure, we'll take a look at some of the records that might not be online, the helpful tools that you might want to take along if doing a genealogy trip, and what are some of the reasons that you would want to visit your ancestors' hometown. So hopefully we'll see you again next month, and thank you so much for attending this morning.